it wasn't right. Like, I thought that we were over there doing good things and helping these people have democracy and have a functional country, and at the same time protecting our country. But every day I spent over there, I found out that that wasn't necessarily the case. I didn't see us really doing any good work. We weren't doing anything that we said we were going to do. And instead we killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and we tore their nation apart.
What we were instilled with going out was, again, this dehumanizing factor of everyone else in the world. We were seen as the most elite, the best, the better than you of the entire world, and it was the American civilians that were right underneath us. Everyone else was less than human. And because we were told and ingrained in our heads that anyone could possibly be a potential threat and less than human, it made engaging and pulling your trigger and getting off of that vehicle second nature, and the first thing that was in your mental vocabulary of what you should be going for. And I noticed it from the very beginning. The perception from the Iraqis was far different than what we were told it was going to be as well. We were coming into contact with people that, through whatever possible interpreters we could get, were explaining to us the most basic needs. They had no electricity, they had no running water, they had no way of feeding their family, especially after the destruction and mayhem that had been caused for the past 6 months before we first started setting up shop and establishing our bases there. And this lack of communication and being able to understand the needs and the desires permeated the entirety of both of my deployments. From not just in talking and dealing with the local Iraqis, but also in our engagements, and when we came into firefights and conflicts with people that were resisting the occupation, and we began a series of detainments, and we started arresting people like it was nothing. It took very little. In fact, we knew very little. We had no way of truly knowing what was going on out there, and so the solution was arrest everyone and take everyone in.
When we were overseas and we would run into Iraqis in the street and in their homes, and they would tell us, leave, bad Bush is what they would continually chant, or you killed my family, or why is my building destroyed, or why don't I have a school to go to, or why is my hospital destroyed, or why don't we have an economy, or why did you dismantle the police forces? Why are you propping up these corrupt leaders? Anyone, I think, with half of a brain and some sense of morality and consciousness could see on the ground that it was a disaster. One of the stories I tell is the first time, and this will give you an idea of how laissez-faire things take place in Iraq. But the first time, or the laissez-faire attitude in which people process these situations. But when I got out of the Marine Corps, I was taking an English 101 class, and they asked us to write the most traumatic experience of your life. So a lot of kids were writing about like how they got dumped at prom, and how they got kicked off the football team, and different things, and it just sort of spewed out of me, and I had to talk about the first time I had killed someone. And it was an up-close and personal experience. And when that happened and afterwards, what they did, the command and those who we were serving with, they just picked up the body and they threw it out of this drainage ditch. They just threw it on the side of the road. And they cracked a couple of glow sticks and threw it next to the body and hoped that, maybe a helicopter or an ambulance will pick them up in a couple weeks. And when we got back to the base, one of my good friends had taken a picture of the guy's head. So I had shot him in the front of his head, in the back of his head, and in the front of his head had like a softball-sized gaping wound. His brain had fallen out of his head, and it was a mess. And one of our Marines actually jumped on the body and started punching it in the face. He was so angry they didn't know what to do. And then when we got back on base after one of my fellow Marines took a picture of this, he put it up as a laptop screensaver on his laptop. So he wanted to remind everybody. It's like, this is what we're here for. We're here to kill as many Iraqis as possible. That's what people were motivated to do. That's what we were trained to do. This notion of democracy building and bringing humanity, the white man's burden, it's a familiar story. Anyone who reads history is familiar with that story. And it's old. It's been going on for a long time.
This man right here was my third confirmed kill. As you can see, he was riding his bicycle. Later on in the day, we went ahead and we had CBS Laura Logan with us, but she was with the other squad. And so she wasn't with us. So myself and 2 other people went ahead and took out some individuals because we were excited about the firefight we had just gotten into, and we didn't have a cameraman or woman with us. With that being said, anytime we did have embedded reporters with us, our actions would change drastically. We never acted the same. We were always on key with everything, did everything by the books. The man on the bicycle, he was left in the street for about 10 minutes until we realized that we needed to leave where we were. And his body was dragged about 10 feet to the right of him, where his body was thrown behind a rock wall, and his bicycle was thrown on top of him.
One time I called home. I had run a mission to Camp Victory, which is in Baghdad, which is by Baghdad International Airport. And I called home and I was talking with my grandmother, and she said to me, "Oh my God, are you okay? We just heard on the news that a convoy had been attacked." And I was very shocked by that, because in Iraq that wasn't news. Because it wasn't that one convoy got attacked. The reality is that convoys were always getting attacked every day, and every time, it even got to the point that every time we left the wire, something bad would happen.
What's the wire?
Our base camp, our perimeter. Mm-hmm. So, that was very shocking to me that somehow the scale of this war was not being relayed in its entirety back to the American people, that they were still hearing news like, oh, one soldier was attacked here, or this incident happened here. It very much neglected the overall situation.
What did we do? Well, my fellow Marines were taking it upon themselves to shoot at Iraqis, beat up the women, smack prisoners around, torture them, play with dead corpses, take pictures with them. The kinds of things that we see in the media that are talked about as aberrations or a few bad apples was my regular experience in Iraq. And what prepared us for that? Well, the training, and it's inherent to 13 weeks of boot camp and 8 weeks of training you how to be a well-oiled killer in the School of Infantry. And we must not forget that that's exactly what the military institution is there for, is to kill and destroy.
I laughed as I heard a story. One of the platoons had strapped dead bodies from a gunfight to the hoods of their Humvees and drove around the city for hours, blasting death metal music as they terrorized the population. Just another Tuesday to me. Back on post, there was a time when somehow, someway, an Iraqi had managed to get himself lost and ended up knocking on the door to my post, which happened to be next to our sleeping area. As I answered the door and saw the Iraqi standing there, I accepted my fate, and I jumped on top of him. I accepted he was a suicide bomber, and I had seen my last day as I began to punch him. Brutally, I sat on top of him, punching him as hard as I could. After a moment, I got him under control and handcuffed him. He was simply a man who had just gotten lost. I was punished harshly, not for my actions, not for harming an unarmed civilian, but for not killing him. I was told he should have been killed for being there, and I would have been protected. I was forced to burn human feces, stand hours of additional post, and physically punished. I was ostracized and called a wuss and a girl for not killing him.
Proper rules of engagement serve an important strategic purpose, which is to legitimize military force. By projecting an image of restraint and professionalism, militaries seek to reinforce the idea that they're protecting local residents rather than oppressing them. Not only do these rules undermine support for any local opposition, they also deflect accusations of occupation and oppression from foreign countries and in some cases the people of the country the military is supposedly serving. Martin van Creveld, who was an Israeli military historian, even asserted some years ago that the British had not yet been driven from Northern Ireland because they were taking more casualties than the Irish were. The US, on the other hand, has not chosen to use rules of engagement in the same way in Iraq. The rules of engagement have been broadly defined and loosely enforced to protect US service members at the expense of the Iraqi people, and anyone who tells you different is either a liar or a fool. During the invasion of Iraq, during the push north to Baghdad, the rules of engagement given to me were gradually reduced to the point of non-existence, similar to the cases that you've already heard. When we first crossed the Kuwait-Iraq border at Azubair in March 2003, we were operating under Geneva Convention guidelines and were authorized to shoot anyone wearing a military uniform except for medical and religious personnel unless they had surrendered. By the time we got to Baghdad, however, I was explicitly told by my chain of command that I could shoot anyone who came closer to me than I felt comfortable with if that person did not immediately move when I ordered them to do so, keeping in mind I don't speak Arabic. The general attitude that I got from my chain of command was better them than us, and the guidance that we were given reinforced that attitude across the ranks. It was an attitude that I watched intensify greatly throughout the course of my 3 tours.
During Operation Blackjack, my troop was specifically instructed by our troop commander, a captain, that a particular sector we were moving to recon and force was now considered a free fire zone. I specifically recall him telling us that there were, quote, no friendlies in the area. And then he specifically said, quote, game on, all weapons free. It's important to understand these are not unusual orders. These are not even unnecessary orders. And the nature of war and this particular war, these are necessary whenever a situation gets unusually dangerous or confused, which happens quite often, as I'm sure you can imagine. Upon arrival in the area, we found the streets, besides being littered with wreckage of, vehicles. Who knows if it's a civilian vehicle or an enemy vehicle? There's no way to tell. But wreckage of vehicles. There wasn't a single building in this neighborhood that hadn't had a hole shot through it or something explode inside of it. This place was totally destroyed. The streets were littered with numerous human and animal corpses, not just men, but all manner of humanity. I personally saw no military gear or weapons of any kind on any of the bodies that I came across. I personally did not fire my weapon on this operation, but I do know that other members of my unit embraced the weapons-free order by firing, for example, by firing indiscriminately into occupied civilian vehicles and at civilians themselves, using both personal weapons such as rifles and crew-served vehicle-mounted weapons such as machine guns, coaxial machine guns of various caliber.
This is the rules of engagement card that I was issued for our deployment to Iraq. And this is held up as the gold standard of conduct in the occupation right now. I'll just read a part of it. It says, nothing on this card prevents you from using deadly force to defend yourself. Enemy military and paramilitary forces may be attacked subject to the following instructions. Positive identification is required prior to engagement. Positive identification is reasonable certainty, and that's in quotes on the card, that your target is a legitimate military target. And of course, we're supposed to keep this in our breast pocket here. But when Marines are put in a situation where they receive fire and all they see is a muzzle flash coming from a building, and they don't have positive identification, but they know that if they return fire through that window or towards that building, that they're more likely to live through whatever's going on. It's a really difficult situation, and I think it's criminal to put such patriotic Americans who have sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America in a situation where their morals are at odds with their survival instincts. During the siege of Fallujah, we changed rules of engagement more often than we changed our underwear. At first it was, you follow the rules of engagement, you do what you're supposed to do, and then There were times when it was you can shoot any suspicious observer, so someone with binoculars and a cell phone was fair game. And that really opened things up to a lot of subjectivity. But also firing at muzzle flashes into the city, firing Mark 19s into the city became common practice. And at one point, we imposed a curfew on the city of Fallujah, and at that point, we were told we were allowed to shoot anything after dark. And fortunately, I was never put in that situation to make that decision, but there were a lot of Marines, on the positions around me who were forced to make those choices. About the situation being criminal, about the criminality of putting Marines in this position, because when you tell them that the rules of engagement are you can shoot anything that moves after dark, we have a reasonable certainty based on our intelligence or whatever that anything that moves after dark is an enemy combatant. Well, you can't expect those Marines to stop and analyze every situation, because they're going to operate based on those rules of engagement, and they're going to do what they have to do. So I got up in the middle of the night when the Iraqi policeman at our checkpoint got the call, and through pointing and pantomime and the little Arabic I spoke at the time and an Arabic translation dictionary, I was able to help figure out that there were Marines shooting at Iraqi firefighters and cops, and we were able to send it down our chain of command and stop that from happening. But how many incidents like that happened where it wasn't so clear?
Rules of engagement may change like the tides of the ocean or the winds of a hurricane, but people don't come back from the dead. Sometimes, from 1 hour to the next, the rule of engagement would change. At 10 a.m., someone with a shovel on a certain street would be killed, and at 10:30, he shouldn't be killed. You can change the rule, but you can't bring that person back to life. And when you can't bring him back to life, you tell me that I just murdered him.
It was easy for Marines and for soldiers to engage once they had been engaged, but the cloudy part of it was when you could fire, or when you could fire before you had been fired on, when you could engage people supposedly involved in suspicious activity. And these were things that weren't ever explained to us, or if they were contradicted 5 days later and turned on themselves. We used other contradictions that I saw when I was out there were the use of tracking and cataloging systems. We used a computer system that all of these people that we were arresting and detaining, whether they had anything to do with an attack or not, we would put them into a system that scanned your retinal, your eyes, your fingerprints. It would take pictures of you and log and track when you were arrested, and solely for the purpose of having you in the system and justification if you were seen and arrested again, that they would have already some kind of evidence on you as being a resistor or someone who has anti-United States or anti-coalition sentiment. Again, adding up to enough evidence to throw people in places like Abu Ghraib without charging them or without anything like that for an indefinite amount of time. We were stressed in boot camp. We were told about the Geneva Conventions and these so-called rules or norms of warfare that the United States supposedly abides by. Yet when I was in Iraq, constantly did I find our units utilizing schools and hospitals and things that completely against the Geneva Conventions in order to conduct offensive operations from. In fact, my unit in particular was was utilizing an operation of undercover work, where we would dress up in local Iraqi attire. We would get into Iraqi vehicles with all of our gear underneath us, hidden, and then go out and patrol the streets in that way. It got to the point where it was just too obvious for us to be driving through in local or in Humvees and being able to show our force. So they began going in undercover operations, and again another radical departure from whatever the Geneva Conventions that the United States talks about are.
We knew every way to walk right around the line of engagement, the rules of engagement. What a joke. To us grunts, rules of engagement were not rules at all, but merely words on a piece of paper somewhere printed for the sole purpose of protecting officers if we grunts actually got caught.
My unit was involved in a 2-day firefight. Shortly after the firefight was underway, the same commander who had given us the mission issued an order that everyone wearing a black dishdasha and a red headscarf was automatically displaying hostile intent and a hostile action and was to be shot. An hour or two later, he gave another order, this time that everyone on the streets was considered an enemy combatant. I can remember one instance after the order was given that afternoon when we came around a corner and an unarmed Iraqi man stepped out of a doorway. I remember the Marine directly in front of me raising his rifle and aiming at the unarmed man, and then I think just for some psychological reason my brain blocked out the actual shots, because the next thing I remember is stepping over the dead man's body to clear the room that he came out of. I remember that it was a storage room, and it was full of some Arabic brand of Iraq, or some Arabic brand of cheesy poofs, like Cheetos. There weren't any weapons in the area except for ours. The commander told us a couple of weeks later that over 100 enemy, quote-unquote, had been killed, and to the best of my knowledge, that number includes all of the people who were shot for simply walking down the street in their own city. After the firefight was over, the standing rules of engagement for my unit were changed so that Marines didn't need to identify a hostile action anymore in order to use deadly force. They just had to identify hostile intent. The rules also explicitly stated that carrying a shovel, standing on a rooftop while speaking on a cell phone or holding binoculars, or being out after curfew were automatically considered hostile intent, and we were authorized to use deadly force. And I can only guess how many innocent people died during my tour because of those orders.
We're supposed to operate under the Geneva Conventions, meaning you can only shoot people under certain conditions. They have to be carrying a weapon or wearing a uniform and be identified as an enemy combatant. Well, at this point, the Army had gone through the day before, and they had said this town was secure. Well, when the Marines came through, we got hit really hard right off the bat. About 18 guys died, and at that point, they just ceased all operations and said, "All right, nobody else is going into this city until it's finally secured." At that point, they pulled everyone back. We sat on the outskirts of the city, on the other side of the bridge to Nazariya. And that whole night, our tanks went in, and I listened to them raise this city. Tanks, watched the mortars fly overhead, gunships circling the whole night. What I drove through that next morning was just a mass graveyard. You know, we had to drive over human corpses the whole way through the city just to get out. And because they declared that city weapons free. You know, you do not have to be carrying a weapon to be shot. And so they changed the rules of engagement, and we went in, and we shot everything that moved. And it's the same shit that was going on in Vietnam when they declared it, but they just called it a different name. They called it free fire zones. We had full chem suits, gas masks. Right before we got to Baghdad, we're on the outskirts of the city, and all of a sudden the report came down, and they said, Intel says you can take off your chemical equipment. And granted, I mean, we were very happy to do so because, you know, this was extremely hot to wear this on top of all your gear, and it was very cumbersome and uncomfortable. But here we are, you know, about to enter the lion's den of Baghdad, and they say, you can take it off. I mean, they knew there was no WMDs. And the fact is, it was getting too hot, and they were starting to have some real problems with heat casualties. Put away your equipment, everything's okay. You know, it wasn't until I got back and I started to do my own research and I realized, you want to talk about WMDs, you know, it was the damn munitions we were using. You know, my battalion was using depleted uranium. You know, I had depleted uranium rounds on my truck. And this stuff, you know, it's a highly effective anti-armor weapon. It will penetrate anything. It's also highly toxic and it's highly radioactive. It's also completely useless in Iraq because Iraq has no armor. Iraq does not have tanks. And yet we are dumping this munition into their country as we speak, 4 years into this occupation. You know, and this stuff is poisoning not only Iraq. When it hits its target, these particles instantly vaporize and go up into the atmosphere. They've found depleted uranium particles on the skin of spacecraft. I mean, this is poisoning the globe. We do not have to use this material. You can use tungsten. It also penetrates armor. But tungsten is very expensive, and depleted uranium is free. It's a byproduct of nuclear waste. And we are using Iraq as a dumping ground to get rid of our nuclear waste. The VA refuses to admit it. They refuse testing. I've tried to, for 2 years now I've been tried to be tested, and every day it's a different story. Saying, oh, well, we don't have the proper tests, or it's not an issue, come back tomorrow. This will absolutely be the Agent Orange of this war.